Brexit could put at risk the UK's nuclear industry and access to a market worth an estimated £1 trillion. The union prospect says that new independent bodies should be set up to develop and protect the industry. When we leave the European Union, we'll also leave the European Atomic Energy Community, known more widely as Euratom. The European Commission has made it clear that the UK will have sole responsibility for the safety of fissile material after leaving, and will have to pay for the transfer of buildings and equipment. Professor Francis Liven is from the Dalton Nuclear Institute at the University of Manchester, and I asked him about the role of Euratom.
The importance of Euratom is that it's a treaty that we signed up to back in the 1950s, which governs the security and safeguards of nuclear material. It governs the movement of nuclear material across national boundaries, and it also governs research both in nuclear fission and also in nuclear fusion.
Right, and we're going to leave it, the government says. It's surely not that difficult to replicate, is it?
I think it could prove more problematic than we think. We would have to create a mechanism for demonstrating the security and safeguarding of nuclear material in the UK. Currently, we report to Euratom, and this is then forwarded on to the United Nations in the form of the International Atomic Energy Agency, because this is ultimately an obligation we have to the United Nations. So we would have to recreate that reporting system. The second thing is that we would have to recreate a mechanism for transboundary movement of nuclear materials with a whole bunch of individual countries. And indeed, we also actually presently hold nuclear material, for example, some plutonium at Sellafield, which actually belongs to other European countries. So the status of that material would have to be defined.
So moving the stuff around is quite a problematic area, is it?
Yes. As you might imagine, there's a great deal of care taken, there's a great deal of paper involved, and you need to get all sorts of approvals for all sorts of people, from all sorts of people, even within the Euratom system. Going outside the Euratom system to a lot of bilateral relationships could get really very complicated.
But presumably by getting out of this organisation, which we must pay into, we will save money at least.
I think it's far from clear that we will. Because we have these obligations to the United Nations, then unless we want to have the same international status as, say, North Korea in this matter, we'll have to replicate a lot of the processes that we currently access through Euratom. So that won't come with no cost. In the research side, Euratom has historically been an area where for every pound the UK has put into the pot, it has had more than £1 coming back to it. So again, there's a question over whether that level of research funding will continue post-Brexit. So I think it's absolutely far from clear that there will be any obvious benefits from withdrawal from Euratom.
Professor Francis Liven. The Nuclear Industries Association last week called for associate membership of Euratom, but there's a problem with that. Although the 60-year-old organisation is not formally part of the European Union, it is under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and that's the difficulty for the Prime Minister. The former Chief of Staff to the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, is James Chapman. He told Sam Coates on the Week in Westminster here on Radio 4 that she may well be forced to change her position.
The government has announced an intention to withdraw from the Euratom Treaty at the same time as we leave the EU. And the reason for that appears to be there is a locus for the European Court of Justice in that treaty, which covers the free movement of nuclear scientists. Now, I would have thought that the UK would want to continue welcoming nuclear scientists who are probably all being paid six figures and paying lots of tax, but withdrawing from it because of this absolutist position on the European Court. I think that she could show some flexibility in that area and argue, actually, surely we want nuclear scientists to come to this country.
Do you think if she moved on Euratom, there'd be cheering around the cabinet table?
I think there would be, and I think if she doesn't shift on Euratom, the Parliament will shift it for her.
James Chapman. Mike Clancy is General Secretary of the Prospect Union, which represents nuclear engineers and specialists, and he's in the studio now with me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What is it you're worried about?
Well, this is, in our opinion, a piece of collateral damage arising from the Brexit negotiations, which is unnecessary. We've been saying for months that there needs to be an evidence and expert influence to the Brexit process, and particularly in relation to Euratom. Now, the government is supposed to be in more of a listening mode post-election. Although some of the items which you've already highlighted here suggest that its listening is limited. And I think it's very important that we have a Brexit which is based upon expertise. It's interesting that commentators over the weekend were, again, reflecting upon the importance of experts. My union is full of them. And I hope we can have a renaissance of experts who can ensure that we don't have careless overconfidence in relation to an exit from Euratom, which is unnecessary.
Yeah, but what is it specifically that worries you about leaving it?
Well, it impacts the wider policy framework in relation to the energy industry. It will impact our ability to fund research and development in an industry which can be a national champion. Our launch today of our manifesto in this respect points out how important nuclear is to the economy. And it's almost a benchmark of the broader Brexit negotiations, because if the government didn't take a dogmatic view about European institutions and the ECJ, as your previous contributor suggested, we could have a different approach here.
So you think we should go for something like associate membership?
Well, first of all, it's going to take a huge amount of negotiations. The idea that we would do this in the same time period as exiting the European Union is, I think, quite unlikely. Whether it be associate membership or simply a preparedness to accept a different framework for the resolution of disputes and actually stay a member of Euratom. We've not seen anything which actually justifies leaving Euratom as opposed to the broader process of you leaving the European Union. Euratom is a key industrial platform that benefits this country in terms of jobs, supply chain and the movement of material.
But isn't it a bit of scaremongering when you say that the risk of losing access to £1 trillion market? I mean, if we're good at it, we'll carry on being good at it.
Well, take, for example, the Joint European Torus at Culham. This is a European-wide collaboration funded by the European Union. That is directly at risk. That's just one example. International treaty and international economics applies to the nuclear industry, and we need to be part of that community. Euratom's key to that.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike Clancy. And the Chief Executive of the Nuclear Industry Association is Tom Greatrex, and he's with me now from our radio car. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mark.
Is the union prospect we've just heard from then, are they right to be concerned?
I think they are. I mean, I think it's not just Prospect and the unions that are concerned. The industry is concerned. You've heard from the heart of government, or someone very recently, the heart of government over the weekend, the level of concern there is amongst members of the cabinet. People are concerned because this is a very complex area to get right. There is a very short timescale to seek to replicate a whole series of arrangements that have been built up over decades, and it's unnecessary. And I think that is the important point here, is this is not the fundamentals of leaving the European Union that people voted for a year or so ago. This is actually about how we ensure that our power stations, our medical systems are all are able to continue to function, and to be able to replicate everything that is covered by Euratom in that very short 21 months or so that we've got left. I think if it's well nigh impossible to do in that time frame, and actually isn't really what we need to do. And I think,
how long would it take?
Well, it could take several years. There was an official from government quoted in a press article a few days ago suggesting it might be as much as 7 years. I don't think that's unrealistic. And I think, what
would happen in that time if that's true?
Well, if we got to a point that we left the European Union and Euratom on the 29th of March 2019 and other arrangements weren't in place and there wasn't a transition period in place, then the ability to be able to move material would stop. It would impact, the nuclear industry is an international industry. So when a power station, for example, undergoes routine maintenance and a part gets refurbished, quite often that can happen in Italy or Germany. So even moving a part from an existing power station to get that refurbishment and get it back again, routine stuff, all of that becomes very, very difficult. The ability to be able to have any sort of relationship with the United States, for example, without there being a nuclear cooperation agreement in place becomes impossible. All of these things, there are a whole series of factors that need to be dealt with. The government's got two choices, really. One is either ensure there's a transitional period to make sure we get them in place, or actually just think about this again, be pragmatic and not dogmatic, have some limited scope for the ECJ or some other arrangement, and seek to negotiate with the European Commission a different arrangement, an arrangement that enables the UK to continue to be part of Euratom.
I just wanted to ask you about one specific thing, about the movement of radioactive material that's used in hospitals. Would that be affected?
Some would, not all, but some would. And so, this is a good example of the implications of this. There are areas that no one really thought it had very much to do with that are potentially caught up in this. And so,
what would that mean for hospitals then?
Well, it would mean potentially the inability to get new stock of particularly isotopes that can be used in some cancer treatments, for example. That could have that implication. So, there are good reasons, well outside of issues around how we generate power or what we do with what happens at sites like Sellafield, for example, that are caught up in this. That just highlights the complexity of this treaty, arrangements that have been built up over decades, and actually necessitates that if the rhetoric from Philip Hammond, from things that we understand that Greg Clark has said, from things that Keir Starmer from the opposition side has said about trying to ensure that we go through this process of leaving the European Union with the limited impact on jobs and growth and economic opportunities and activity, then this actually is a test case for how you can have a more pragmatic attitude. I think it's incumbent on the government to seek to explore another way of doing this, because the UK government, the European Union, as well as the industry in both parts of Europe, want the same thing at the end of this, which is to accord to the same international standards that we accord to now, to ensure that our supply chains are able to continue to trade with each other, to ensure that we are able to guarantee our power supplies and we don't impact on medical treatment. The best way of doing that is by having a different approach and seeking to find a way of having some form of associate membership, or at the very least a transitional period that is long enough to enable to make sure we don't have the cliff edge that the government said they want to avoid.
Tom Greatrex, thanks very much. Well, the Conservative peer Lord Willetts, David Willetts, was Science Minister in the Coalition Government and is Chair of the British Science Association. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Do you understand why we're leaving Euratom?
I understand the kind of strict construction that because some of its decisions could be covered by the ECJ, we have to leave. But I must say, as it is a separate legal entity from the European community, I was a bit surprised when I discovered that we had to leave, and I hope we can be pragmatic and find some way of staying involved in Euratom.
But it does seem the Prime Minister is particularly concerned, and of course a lot of your former colleagues are very concerned with being under the power of the European Court.
That seems to be the issue. On the other hand, it's not clear how intrusive that actually is. And looking back to the Brexit campaign, I can't remember any Brexiteers, however hard-line, saying that we had to leave Euratom. So I hope that we can stay involved because Britain benefits, and also actually the continental Europeans, I'm sure, want us involved. So it would be win-win if we could stay involved in some way.
So what would you like? Some sort of associate membership or just staying?
Well, some kind of associate membership, the closer the better, because we gain from it. I mean, you've heard a lot already about the regulatory responsibility, but for me, thinking back to my time as Science Minister, they fund research in Britain. They fund research in nuclear fusion and Culham, and that sleepy village outside Oxfordshire has actually got Science Kit, which is the hottest place in the solar system. And British scientists and technologists take the temperature of nuclear materials up to 200 million degrees. That is at the moment experimental science. In the future, it's going to become real electricity generation, and it's in our economic interest to stay involved with that, not to see it all moving to the continent.
And of course one's heard lots of anecdotal evidence, at least, of scientists being concerned generally about the impact of Brexit on research.
Yeah, and of course that's partly funding, and the Chancellor has already made it clear that he will compensate for loss of funding. But it's wider than that. It's participation in cross-national groups. That's why some form of involvement in Euratom is important. And actually, incidentally, that's why I am sure scientists on the continent are telling their governments to try to be as flexible with us as possible. Because it's not just that we need them, they need us. So it should be possible to make deals that keep us very closely involved, and Euratom is a very good test case.
It's also an interesting, some might argue, microcosm of the problem with the single market, that we want access to these organisations, we don't want to be ruled by them.
Yes, and if we are outside the single market but wish to sell our goods and services to the European Union, we'll probably have to comply with their regulations. But again, when it comes to Euratom, that's a good example of the gains from staying involved. If we stay involved, we can help shape the regulatory regimes for nuclear power. We can be one of the key global standard setters and shapers of the regime for nuclear fusion as that develops. So staying involved maximises our influence. If we're outside, we're at much greater risk of being the passive takers and recipients of rules and regulations or standards set by others. And one of the advantages of being world-class in science is our scientists are involved in helping shape standards for the technologies of the future, which in turn gives us an opportunity to exploit them commercially.
Do you detect a new sort of tone about Brexit from your old colleagues in the Cabinet?
I think that post the election there has been a shift in tone, and I welcome that. And it's basically just confronting the economic reality that it's in our interest to stay closely involved with our closest market, and also people with whom we've got strong working research relationships, which is not just about money. They're about the exchange of ideas and about our influence on them as well as their influence on us.
Lord Willetts, thanks very much.